The ocean breeze off the coast of Okinawa is usually sweet, but at 9 in the morning, the salty air suddenly turned thick with the heavy scent of impending slaughter. Picture 12 Chinese Z20 helicopters slicing through the dense morning fog, rocketing straight toward Marine Corps Base Camp Foster. Inside those metal bellies sat 180 Special Forces operatives from the People and Oppo's Liberation Army, gripping their rifles, totally drunk on the fantasy of crippling the American military in the Pacific. They thought they had the ultimate surprise attack, a masterclass in strategy whipped up in some sterile, disconnected briefing room. But reality was about to hit them like a freight train. They had no idea that below them, 600 deeply furious United States Marines were already waiting with safeties off. Early warning radars had painted their neat little formation from 70 kilometers out. Over on the tarmac, squadrons of F-15 Eagles were already humming, starving for a dogfight. Over the next 31 agonizing minutes, this entire invasion force would be violently erased from existence. No daring escapes. Not a single chopper flying home. This was not going to be a battle, but a brutal, public execution for anyone foolish enough to test the absolute supremacy of the United States Marine Corps. So get comfortable, because you are about to step into the bloodiest, most terrifying 31 minutes of modern warfare, an event forever burned into history as Operation Fortress Defense. Before we plunge into the chaos, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are tuning in from. Let us rewind the tape exactly 72 hours before all hell broke loose. Tucked away in a hazy, cigar smoke-filled office belonging to the Eastern Theater Command, a wildly delusional fantasy called Operation Dragon Strike was given the green light. General Zhang Wei, a man who spent his entire career pushing little plastic markers around maps instead of dodging actual bullets, stood proudly before the Central Military Commission. He pitched them a total pipe dream. His goal was nothing less than ripping the United States Marines right out of Okinawa. It was a massive, sweeping ambition built entirely on a foundation of pure, catastrophic ignorance. Folks in Beijing honestly convinced themselves they could pull off the unthinkable, a direct, kinetic strike on an American fortress sitting on Allied soil, something nobody had even dared to whisper about for over 70 years. The suits at the top genuinely believed that a dozen Harbin Z20 choppers and a handful of volunteer operators could somehow fracture the American empire. They dressed it up as a surgical strike, but it was nothing more than a guided tour straight into the meat grinder. The blueprint was so bold it bordered on absolute insanity. The idea was to touch down at 6 different zones inside Camp Foster at the exact same time, blow the armories to pieces, flatten the sleeping quarters, inflict maximum American casualties, and vanish before anyone could even sound the alarm. To Zhang Wei, this was a legendary propaganda victory waiting to happen. He wanted to broadcast to the entire planet that America was soft, that its mighty bases would crumble like dry sand under the claws of the Eastern Dragon. They mapped out every single inch on paper, handing their guys QBZ-95 rifles and blocks of C4, assuming the 600 Marines living on that base were just tired, lazy guards walking in circles. What a monumental, fatal mistake. They looked at American restraint and saw cowardice, picking the literal worst place on Earth to test that theory. Operation Dragon Strike was never a real military strategy. It was just a fragile illusion woven out of staggering arrogance. Those young operators were promised chestfuls of medals and eternal glory, completely unaware that their mission was essentially a state-sponsored suicide pact. They thought they were going to make history, but the only history they were about to write was starring as the victims in the most embarrassing military slaughter of the 21st century. War is a numbers game, and if you read the math wrong, those numbers quickly turn into an obituary. The Chinese top brass walked into this fight carrying a spreadsheet packed with pure fiction, resulting in the most disastrous mathematical collapse ever recorded in modern combat. They like to call it tactical genius, but anyone with a pulse would call it a pre-programmed death wish. There were 7 monumental blunders that guaranteed those 180 elite soldiers would become nothing more than names carved into granite in under an hour. First off, they completely failed to realize what kind of monster they were poking. Camp Foster is not some sleepy, forgotten outpost in the middle of nowhere. It is the sprawling, breathing lair of a full Marine regiment. We are talking about 600 trigger pullers. Not fresh-faced recruits, but scarred, combat-tested veterans who treat their weapons like an extension of their own bodies, living in a permanent state of lethal readiness 24 hours a day. Sending 180 guys to hunt down 600 professional war fighters in their own backyard is not courage, it is just spectacular stupidity. Their second blunder was trusting the myth of invisibility. The pilots honestly thought skimming the ocean waves would keep them hidden from American eyes. The radar grids in Okinawa locked onto their signatures from 70 kilometers away. Every rotation of their rotor blades, every tiny shift in altitude was glowing bright on the control screens. While the assault teams were busy double-checking their tactical gear in the back of the choppers, the Marines below had already finished their morning coffee and racked their charging handles. The element of surprise was dead and buried long before they even saw the shoreline. Then came the third mistake, completely misjudging how fast the Eagles would fly. The planners figured they would have at least half an hour to run wild before the Air Force bothered to show up. Wrong. It took exactly 180 seconds. 3 fleeting minutes. That is all the time it took for 4 F-15 Eagles to launch from Kadena Air Base and tear open the sky. Those steel beasts did not show up to issue warnings over the radio. They came packing air-to-air missiles with one single, violent intention, turning 12 helicopters into raining scraps of burning metal. The fourth miscalculation was ignoring the absolute nightmare of home field advantage. Marines run base defense drills constantly. They know every single brick, every dark corner, and every interlocking field of fire on that property. To them, Camp Foster is a deadly chessboard where they already own all the winning moves. Every barracks is a hardened bunker, every upper window is a sniper hide. Stepping into that base was like a pack of blind mice wandering into a maze wired with high-voltage traps. Their fifth error was flipping the manpower paradox upside down. Standard military doctrine dictates you need 3 attackers for every 1 defender just to break even. Here, the math was violently backwards. At every single drop zone, 30 Chinese operators stepped out to face 100 heavily armed Marines. A 1-to-3 disadvantage at the absolute bleeding edge of the fight. That is not a battle, that is a blender. They were not just beaten, they were liquefied by overwhelming, inescapable firepower. The sixth massive oversight was forgetting about the alliance. They convinced themselves this was strictly a boxing match with the Americans, totally forgetting that Okinawa belongs to Japan. The Japan Self-Defense Forces instantly threw an airtight steel ring around the perimeter, choking off every possible avenue of escape by land. The invaders were trapped in a colossal iron cage with 0 reinforcements and 0 exits. And finally, the seventh and absolute deadliest mistake of them all, never provoke a United States Marine. They are the most relentlessly aggressive infantry machine on the face of the planet, and when you attack them where they sleep, you invite pure ruin. You shoot at one Marine, you are instantly at war with 600 of his violently loyal brothers. There is no hesitation, no mercy, and no quarter given. The planners brought a plastic butter knife to a heavy machine gun fight, and the cost of admission was total, unapologetic annihilation. At exactly 20 minutes and 30 seconds past 9, the moment of terrifying truth finally arrived. 12 Z-20 helicopters dropped out of the sky, hammering down across 6 different landing zones inside the fence line of Camp Foster. The side doors ripped open and 180 Special Forces soldiers poured out, genuinely believing they were the authors of a bold new chapter in warfare. Instead, they walked right into the gaping jaws of a firepower machine that had been starving for a fight. The 31 minutes of absolute, unfiltered hell officially kicked off right then. Over at Landing Zone Alpha, positioned near the barracks, 2 choppers touched down and dumped 30 shooters onto the asphalt to storm the buildings. They crept up expecting to find Americans asleep in their racks, but what they found was a relentless, blinding monsoon of lead. 100 Marine shooters had already taken up perfectly concealed positions on balconies, rooftops, and behind reinforced glass. M4 rifles screamed through the morning air while M249 squad automatic weapons chewed through their belts, spitting out terrifying walls of suppression. Inside the first 60 seconds, 15 elite operators simply folded, their bodies hitting the dirt completely lifeless. The ones who survived that initial barrage scrambled behind the thin metal bodies of their helicopters, shivering in sheer panic. But hiding was a fatal choice. Lance Corporal Davis hoisted an AT-4 anti-armor rocket onto his shoulder and squeezed the trigger, transforming the idling chopper into a spectacular, rolling fireball that melted down any lingering hope of survival. Landing Zone Alpha was entirely wiped out in exactly 3 minutes. Not a single intruder was left taking a breath. Down at Landing Zone Bravo, the armory, the situation was even bleaker. This was supposed to be the crown jewel of the raid, and it is exactly where the enemy choked on their most humiliating defeat. Before the 30 operators there could even raise their rifles to acquire a target, 2 javelin missiles ripped down from the heavens with a terrifying, bone-shaking screech. Both helicopters evaporated into clouds of twisted scrap metal in the blink of an eye, the shockwave rattling the concrete for miles. Emerging from the billowing smoke like absolute phantoms, 50 Marines launched a devastating close-quarters counterattack. The popping rhythm of carbines, the deep thud of grenades, and the desperate, fading screams of the trapped soldiers all blended together into a sickening symphony of violence. When the smoke finally cleared, all 30 attackers were dead in the dirt, and the American casualty count sat precisely at 0. That right there is the brutal difference between rehearsed drills on paper and raw, unfiltered killer instinct. Moving over to Landing Zone Charlie, the command center, the objective was simple: cut off the head of the snake. Colonel Thompson and his command staff were comfortably tucked behind thick walls of reinforced steel, quietly watching the slaughter unfold on high-definition security monitors. The assault team fired rocket-propelled grenades at the bunker, but the explosive rounds barely managed to scorch the exterior paint. Reacting instantly, a perimeter force of 100 Marines executed a flawless, crushing pincer maneuver. Colonel Thompson grabbed the radio and growled a single, chilling order, demanding they exterminate every last one of them and leave absolutely no one standing. 6 minutes later, the entire raiding party was quite literally turned to mist by overlapping fields of 50 caliber machine gun fire. The brains of Camp Foster did not skip a single beat, while the meticulously trimmed lawns were left covered in the wreckage of a failed ambition. Over at Landing Zones Delta and Echo, the fuel depot and the communications tower, it was a masterclass in the quiet art of sniping. Long before the assault teams could even unspool the wiring for their C4 explosive charges, heavy 50 caliber rounds started raining down from elevated heights, surgically harvesting souls. 12 men simply dropped straight to the concrete, their lights punched out with flawless, synchronized headshots. Near the comms tower, it was barely even a firefight, it was live fire target practice. Sure, the invaders managed to spark a little superficial damage, but the American backup generators and redundant systems roared to life without a second of hesitation. To thank them for their trouble, the Marine mortar teams and heavy gunners unleashed a relentless wave of high-explosive shells, erasing every single fingerprint of the intrusion. It was cold, it was wildly efficient, and it was entirely devoid of mercy. Finally, over at Landing Zone Foxtrot by the vehicle depot, the absolute tragicomedy of Dragon Strike reached its final, pathetic act. The 30 guys dropped there suddenly realized the radio chatter from every other sector had gone dead silent. All they had to do was look up to see their last shred of hope evaporate into thin air. 4 F-15 Eagles from Kadena materialized out of the clouds like the literal Grim Reaper, carrying the IM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles. The helicopters idling on the tarmac, waiting to ferry these men home, were instantly blown into clouds of drifting ash and jagged debris. The morale of the ground troops shattered into a million pieces. A handful of them threw their weapons away and threw their hands up, begging to surrender. But in the deafening, blood-soaked chaos of a firefight, after you have already pulled the trigger on a Marine base, crying for a timeout does not work. 28 of them were gunned down where they stood. They only dragged 2 of them away alive, bleeding and broken, just to squeeze them for intelligence in an interrogation room. The crushing mechanism of the American defense only stopped grinding because there was simply no more meat left to feed it. At 24 minutes past 9, As the popping of infantry rifles started to fade away, a massive, chest-thumping roar fractured the sky, dropping the final curtain on Beijing and Apo's ridiculous fantasy. Those 4 F-15 Eagles were not just circling to put on a neat little air show, they were sent to deliver a merciless death sentence straight from the heavens. For the terrified helicopter pilots sitting on the tarmac begging for green lights to lift off, the shrieking whine of American jet engines was the sound of their own funerals. Try to feel the sheer, suffocating panic gripping those operators in that exact moment. They stare at their Z20 chopper, the absolute shining pride of their domestic military industry, just sitting in the mud like half, helpless steps. Up above, Peter's carved tight circles in the clouds, hungry for the kill. The flight lead through his mouth, his voice dead calm as he declared all targets locked and weapons free. 8 highly advanced missiles left their rails in perfect unison. This was not a dramatic, twisting dogfight, it was cold, calculated, high-tech slaughter. Every single missile was a heavy-handed reminder of who truly owns the skies. Catastrophic explosions ripped the earth apart at landing zones Echo and Foxtrot. The 8 remaining helicopters did not just explode, they were instantly vaporized into tens of thousands of white-hot shards of shrapnel. Those fragile little transports never even had the chance to pull back on the stick, let alone fly away. A suffocating wall of greasy black smoke pushed high into the air, blocking out the morning sun and writing a very dark, very clear message across the sky for the guys bleeding out in the grass below. The road is closed, nobody is coming to save you, and your country just dumped you into a meat grinder and threw away the key. Those incoming jets did more than just blow up some expensive hardware, they mentally broke whatever fighting spirit was left in the survivors. Watching their only ride home turn into a raging, spitting inferno broke them completely. The men who strutted onto that base calling themselves the absolute elite were reduced to broken, trembling shadows just waiting for a bullet to end it. This is what it costs to challenge the kings of the sky. When the eagle decides to hunt, the dragon suddenly looks like nothing more than a lizard crawling in the dirt, waiting for a heavy boot to come down. The exit doors slammed shut, and hell officially rolled out the red carpet for its uninvited guests. While the pavement of Camp Foster was still hot and smelling heavily of burnt cordite and shredded invaders, Colonel Thompson was already bored with playing defense. For the Marines, simply stopping an attack is just a polite appetizer before serving up a catastrophic main course of retaliation. A flash priority request was hurled up the chain of command to Indo-Pacific Command, and it was stamped with approval in a blink of an eye. The directive was stunningly simple. Completely shattered the enemy's monopoly, ability to throw another punch, and do it loud enough for the entire world to hear. Let everyone watch and take notes on exactly how America responded when someone gets bold enough to test one of its methods. Practically instantly, 20 F-15 strike Eagles, literal flying dump trucks packed full of explosive missiles, reached the airspace just off the Chinese coast. They did not come bearing strongly worded letters or empty diplomatic threats. They carried 8 extremely precise UV-39 small diameter bombs, weapons capable of threading a needle for miles up in the sky. 6 critical military installations, the absolute beating heart and nervous system that birthed this insane operation, were immediately painted with targeting lasers by the deeply furious aviators. Target number 1 was the very same flight line where those dozen helicopters had launched their foolish weapons. 16 bombs dropped in perfect harmony, punching for the roof of the hangar, turning 15 areas into gravity, smoking flares, and collapsing the flight control tower into a heap of twisted rebar and shattered glass. Target number 2 was the crown jewel itself, the eastern theater command headquarters. The strike eagle shoved a very bloody, very loud message straight down the throat of the reinforced command bunker. Every communication line was instantly severed, trapping the architects of this massive tunnel underground, choking on the dusty ruins of their main core supporting bases suffered the exact same fate. Sprawling ammunition depots cooked out, blooming into bright orange miniature mushroom clouds. Massive barracks were instantly flattened into concrete pancakes, and every single inch of their special forces came down. The collateral damage. Just pure perfect destruction. In a window of barely 15 minutes, the American military drafted a massive receipt, put it out in blinding fire and shattered steel, and hand-delivered it straight back to the mainland. The communication was flawlessly clear. If you even think about lighting a match on our porch in Okinawa, we will burn your entire neighborhood to the ground. This went way beyond a simple retaliatory strike. It was the absolute erasure of their whatever pride again. At exactly 31 minutes past 9, Operation Fortress Defense officially wrapped up. Columns of oily black smoke are still reaching for the clouds above the shattered landing zones, but the deafening roar of the guns has finally gone quiet. And really, heavy silence drapes over Camp Foster, interrupted only by the slow, crunching footsteps of Marine patrols looking through the defense field. Take a long, hard look at the tiny scoreboard and permanently burn it into the memory as the ultimate lesson of what happens when air is collide. 180 operators, a supposed as the operation absolutely neutral. 178 bodies scattered across the land. And absolutely do not forget the horrific invoice that America shoved down the throat of the mainland. 6 major military hubs completely leveled to the foundation, with hundreds of personnel buried under the rubble right in their own dens. China rolled the dice hoping to manufacture an international crisis, and well, they certainly got one, just in the most profoundly embarrassing way imaginable. They desperately wanted to expose a crack in the armor of the American empire. But all they managed to do was film a gorgeous, high-definition commercial for the unbreakable defensive wall of the United States and Japanese alliance. The Japan Self-Defense Forces stood shoulder to shoulder with the Marines, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that anybody foolish enough to step on that island with bad intentions will be violently and unapologetically crushed. Consider this the final, absolute warning to the delusional minds sitting in comfortable chairs in Beijing, or anywhere else on the map for that matter. Never mistake quiet restraint for weakness. Never trick yourself into believing you can outgun 600 United States Marines standing on the dirt of their own home turf. You can sit in a room planning for years, you can train your guys for thousands of hours, but it will only take 31 minutes for the United States Marines to turn all of that effort into bloody, blowing ash. Attacking a Marine base is not an act of war. It is enthusiastically signing your own death warrant. No exceptions to the rule. No survivors allowed to walk away. Absolutely no mercy given. That is the true, unfiltered translation of Semper Fidelis. It means always faithful, always victorious, and always relentlessly obliterating every single enemy that dares to stand in the way. Burn this day into your mind forever, the day a foolish dragon tried to breathe a little fire, and ended up completely incinerating itself in the furious, unforgiving fury of the evil. The battle for Camp Foster is over, but the echo of that violence will ring out until the end of time. If you want to keep witnessing absolute destructive power and the most elite military breakdowns on the internet, hit subscribe and turn on your notifications right this second so you never miss another strike of retribution. Touching a United States Marine is exactly like trying to barehand the raging fires of hell, and you will walk away as ashes every single time.